Welcome to the cool room. I love that. Okay, cool. Let's get to know each other a little before we start. My name is Ellie, not Eli, Ellie. My Twitter is EllieBelly because it rhymes and it helps you learn how to say it. I'm a web engineer at Monzo, which is a digital bank. I'm based in London. This is my face also on Twitter, so you can make sure it's the right account. And this right here, wait, let me use the fancy technology. No, it doesn't work. No. Oh yeah, that's where I'm from. But this is my life story in emoji. And I'm going to tell it to you real quick. I'm not a narcissist, I promise. It has a point. We'll get to that in a second. I was born in Mexico, completely an accident. My parents, fine. But we're actually from Nicaragua, which is where I was, I grew up, I was raised, and I lived there until I was 17. Then I moved to the United States to do a bachelor's degree for school, during which I spent a semester in China doing an exchange program, because I was trying to learn it. It's impossible. And now I live in London for a few years. And we'll come back to this later, but this is sort of like where I'm at. And then that's my Twitter. For those of you who were wondering, that's where Nicaragua is. I know not everyone knows. No, it's not in Africa. It's the skinny bit of the Americas, and that's the United Kingdom, and that's where we are now, in Italy. So I'm here to talk to you today about a topic close to my heart. It's a very glamorous topic, internationalization. If you've ever been around the UK, you might have seen it written with an S. If you're more like American spelling, you've seen it with a Z or a Z. And I'm here to talk to you about this because not a lot of people talk about it, but it's very, very important. And we're going to learn a lot today. Has anyone here tried to internationalize a website before? Is it really easy? No. It's a piece of cake, right? No, it's not. It's actually it's not a very trivial topic. But I think after today, we're going to leave in a place where you'll feel more comfortable with it. All right. So the first thing I want to clear up is to make sure we're all on the same page. I wanted to cover this topic. Internationalization is often written as i18n. What the hell is that, right? So here's the first lesson. This is called a numeronym, which is a number-based word. For example, numbers as sounds like canine from police dog units, or later from texting, I guess. Numbers as meaning, like 411 in the United States means information, or 007, James Bond, hopefully we're all familiar. Or the, of course, very logical, adding up the number of letters between the first and the last, and then using that number instead of the middle of the word. Wow, what a good idea. So in tech, we love this for some reason, because it's shorter to type and we're lazy. You might have seen it with L10N, which is localization, and A11Y, which is accessibility, and I think the most popular numeronym. As a bonus, here's the numeronym for numeronym, N7M. So now that that's covered, I was thinking of how I was going to explain internationalization to you all, and so I consulted my most trusted advisor, the internet, and I found this. On your left here, we have some statistics about the languages that websites are in. You'll notice about 52% are in English, dancing people, followed very not closely by Russian, German, Spanish, Japanese. On the other side, we have internet users by language, only about 25.5% English, followed decently closely by Chinese, Spanish, Arabic, Portuguese, etc. You'll notice these don't match, and that's our fault entirely. So millions of people are coming online every day, and it's generally not English-speaking countries. There's a lot of people coming online every day in places like Indonesia, and getting more access to mobile phones. So really, it's our responsibility as web developers, presumably, to make the web a little more accessible to them as well. So my first sort of message that I want to leave with you is that internationalization is part of accessibility. This is a good slide to tweet. I'll wait. It really is our responsibility. I know it's easy when you're building something to be like, let's make it only in English, or if you're building it something for the local Italian market, let's make it just Italian. But you never know what people's circumstances are. People move, you know, and you never know who you might be leaving out by not making your website more accessible to them. Here's a good definition that I really like from W3C standards. If you internationalize, you design or develop your content, application, specification, and so on, so not just your app, in a way that ensures it will work well for, or can be easily adapted for users from any culture, region, or language. Two things are important here. One is that it can be easily adapted for. This doesn't mean that if you internationalize your site, you have to translate it right away. It means you build it in a way that is adaptable. Maybe you don't have the budget right now. Maybe your boss isn't quite into it yet. But the technology can be adaptable, and the way you build your web app can be moldable to whatever locale you want later. The other is culture, region, or language. It's not just language. You don't just need to have your site in English or Spanish or German or Italian. It's also regional differences, cultural differences, and we'll talk a little more about what that entails later. So, how do you do this? So, for example, you write a web app, whatever framework, whatever thing you want, and you put in some code, but instead of having your strings hard-coded in it, you use a template or a placeholder that then references a separate place where all your strings live, string resources. So then, when you want to translate it, you just add another language, and it looks at a different place, you know? And then you can do it with as many locales as you want. For example, if you had a JSON file, we all love JSON, I know we do. It doesn't matter what it says, but you have an ID and you have a string. And then, when you write your application, maybe in handlebars, you just reference this ID using a library. Or React, use a component with an ID prop. Or plain old JavaScript. It's a function, pass in the ID. If that's hard to see, it's there. Because I know bottom of slides are difficult. So this is sort of what the basis of internationalization looks like in a web app. But it's not just the strings we need to translate. There's a lot to think about. So, language, of course. You know, Italian, English. Writing system and line breaks. Can you render special characters? Is it Chinese? Is it Thai script? Is it the Cyrillic alphabet? Is it Russian? Can you show that? There is formatting date, time, and currency. Are any of you here American besides you yet? What date is that? Yeah, I thought so. So your website is going to have to think about these things. They differ by region. Sometimes it's month, day, year. Sometimes it's day, month. Writing direction, not all languages are left to right. There is right to left, Arabic, Hebrew, and there is some bidirectional text. So if you reference like a title of a book in English in an Arabic website, it's going to be like both directions. And we'll talk more about that later. Ordering, pluralization. Is anyone here Russian? No? Okay. So in Russian, you don't just have a word for like one thing and then many things in plural. You have categories. So like one thing is one word, and then like 2 to 5 things is a different word. And then like 6 to like 11-ish things, somebody back me up, is another word. So you have to make your site flexible to that kind of thing. Grammar and sentence structure. I don't know if anyone's studied any like Chinese or Japanese, but like verbs, nouns, they don't always go in the same order. Relative time, days ago, like when you put a comment on like Facebook, it's like so-and-so commented. And bonus, we're not going to cover this a lot, but color theory varies across regions. For some people, red is bad, but then for some people, red is lucky. So if you have like a calendar and a date is booked and you mark it as red, your user might think that's like an available date or a lucky date. And then responsive design. Some languages have longer words, shorter words, longer text, etc. Piece of cake, right? Real easy. Just do it real quick. So I was like, yeah, sure, piece of cake, but just that cake. It's full of layers. It has crystals. It has flowers. So to help you all understand more about where internationalization comes from, I made my own cake. It's beautiful, yay. These are a lot of the building blocks of internationalization. We're going to go through them one by one, and hopefully by the end, we'll all be experts. Just a note, the top 2 layers are libraries. So those are optional, and I'm just going to use some that I know as examples, but obviously if you have a different language or framework, you can use that too. So I'm going to use something called React Intel for 1 or 2 of the examples. How many of you can read React? JSX, sort of. We'll work on it together. Great. Cool. So first tier of the cake is Unicode. Unicode is a huge player in the internationalization game. The Unicode consortium has the Unicode standard, the UTF-8, UTF-16, which is encoding, which there's 1 number for every character that you need to show, which helps us write Chinese and emoji, which we all love. They develop and extend not only the use of the Unicode standard and the encodings, but also different related globalization standards. So the CLDR and ICU technical committees belong to Unicode, which we'll learn about in a second. They're really cool. And then they also have an algorithm to display bidirectional text, which is really important if you're ever working with right-to-left languages. So let's talk about bidirectional real quick while we're still on Unicode. Each character in Unicode is either strongly or weakly typed as left to right or right to left. So for example, if I wrote Egypt in English, each one of these characters is strongly typed from Unicode as being left to right characters. Egypt in Arabic is strongly typed as being right to left. However, characters on the web are displayed relevant to the document's direction. So there's this attribute called dir for direction in HTML, where you can tell it what direction your text is going in. And because the characters are encoded with Unicode left to right or right to left, if I said, for example, that middle word is the Egypt one, Egypt is, yeah, right to left. But since the document is going left to right, we see that in that order, and it would show up in the order we wrote it. If we switch the direction to right to left, it would show it in the opposite direction from our perspective, because it's starting on the right. But you'll notice that the second word never flips. It's just always right to left. So the document has one direction, but then the words are encoded with a different direction. So, hot tip, if you ever have to make something in Arabic or Hebrew, make sure you use this attribute, dir, because that's how Unicode knows how to display your text, and it'll save you a lot of headache. Thanks, Unicode Consortium. Now, when I was having to do some internationalization for my old job, I started Googling, like, who are all these people, and what are all of these like standards and documents, and I found out, and this is one of my favorite parts, there's something called the Internet Engineering Task Force, which I hope looks like this, because a girl can dream, but fine, probably doesn't. They publish these things called Best Common Practices, or BCP. And there's one called BCP 47, which describes how to write a tag to identify a locale. So on the web, you may have seen this probably. It says that you have a language tag, which is usually a 2-character symbol for a language, and then dash, and then X number of subtags. It's usually two or three, I think. But for example, we have EN, which is English, as spoken in the US, so that's like the sub-tag region, or English as spoken in Great Britain. That's kind of the difference between the S and the Z in internationalization. We have Mongolian, ooh, yeah, in the Cyrillic alphabet, as spoken in Mongolia. MN is the country code for Mongolia. Down here we have Chinese, which is ZH. In the traditional character set, because Chinese has a traditional set and a simplified character set, as spoken in Hong Kong. And then down here we have ES, which is Spanish. 419 is actually a number assigned to a region. So 419 means Latin America and the Caribbean, which is cool. So it's not just as spoken in one country, but a region. And all of those are defined in BCP 47, and that's how you write it. So if you remember my life story, my locales would look like this. So if you were making a website or an app for me, what locale are you going to show me? Anybody? It's not that easy. So here is my hot tip number 2, also extremely photographable. Always, 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 let the user choose their own locale. If you take anything from this talk today, it's this. Always let your user choose their own locale. You don't know where people are living, where they're from, if they're visiting, if they're permanently there. Let them choose. Maybe they want to learn a language. So again, always let your user choose their own locale. Great, you got it. Excellent. I'm glad you remembered. Cool. Moving on up the cake. This is another Unicode thing I'm about to show you, which is one of, at the same time, the coolest parts and also the most boring parts at the same time. There's this thing called the CLDR, the Common Locale Data Repository, which is literally like 20 megabytes of XML that contains the entire world's locales information about stuff like what date format, what time format, time zones, country, cities. How do you say them in that language? How do you call months in that language? What the writing direction is, what the plural cases are, what currency, what's the telephone code. All of this global information lives in this repository. It's amazing. You can just go in there, check it out, and be like, show me what the weekdays are in Spanish. And it's like, yep, sure. Do you want the long version, the short version, the medium version? And they're just there. So it has a special language. You can't really see it that well, but day, type Sunday, abbreviated is DOM for domingo, which is right here in type wide. The truth is that developers will rarely interact with the CLDR. It's mostly for library authors, but if you're ever curious as to what the official, this is all open source, by the way. There's a committee, you can contribute to it. What the official name of a time zone is in Portuguese, you can look it up on the CLDR. And this is not just for the web. Mobile uses this and backend uses this. If you do feel the urge, the deep urge to play with it, it is in JSON format on GitHub if you want to build something, whatever. But I thought that was really cool. I didn't know that existed when I was looking into this talk. So the next part is also a little bit strange, also maintained by the Unicode Consortium. It's called the ICU, International Components for Unicode. And this is where it gets strange. This was originally a library for C++ and Java. But this is a web conference, Ellie, I know. But what ICU did back in the day is defined something called the ICU message format, which is the format you use in your strings that are separated from your application, your string resources. So I'll show you what it looks like. It's sort of templatey. Looks like this. Welcome, name. Name is a variable that you pass in. Curly brackets, sort of like a common templating syntax. You can also tell it things about what you passed in. So you can say, I'm going to pass you a variable called count, and I'm telling you it's a number. So for example, in Spain, the 1000 separator is a period instead of a comma. It knows that because it's on top of the CLDR, and the CLDR knows that. You can also give it some options. So you can say, I'm passing you in a date, but I want you to display it short version. So depending on whether you were in Europe or America, it would show you one of these two. You can also do selects. So you can say, I'm going to pass you a variable, and if it matches the first one, print out this string. If it matches the second one, print out the other one. And then if it matches anything else, use the default. You can also do numbers of things, plural. So you can say, I'm going to pass you a number. If it's 0, show this. If it's 1, show that. And any others, you can use the number that you passed in. Nope, that's this one. No, can't do it. This guy. This is, for example, this is all generally understood by translators too. So when you hand this over to be translated, they can put in the categories to match that language. So for example, remember how I mentioned that Russian thing earlier? Your translator will give the Russian version of this back with more categories based on what the number of things you were referring to. So that's pretty cool. ICU comes in pretty handy, and it's really helpful to know how to write it when you're trying to localize your site. So what is the best practice for the ICU? How do you write strings? First of all, always try to write full sentences when possible. You never know what the grammar is like in the languages you're localizing into. Do not try to build the sentences yourself. I've seen this a lot where people will try to like decide what preposition to use based on some code. Don't do it. Use full sentences. And then any complex argument like the select and the plural, use them as the outermost structure of any message. And this is actually one of the hardest parts because we love to not repeat ourselves, right? And then a lot of the times when you're writing string resources, you do need to repeat yourself. So let's look at an example. Let's say we have a user and they have maybe a gender they picked or didn't. So I want to print out a string that says, he likes to dance the cha-cha in the moonlight. Great. She also likes to dance the cha-cha in the moonlight. But then, when I get to they, if they didn't pick one, they likes is not grammatically correct. So I've done this wrong. That's fine. I'll just put likes inside of the select. He likes, she likes, they like. Singular. Easy. But what happens when I actually change the language? Maybe the pronouns aren't there. Maybe the verb goes later or earlier. So the actual correct way to do this is like this. Full sentences. Yes, you are repeating yourself. Oh, no. It's the end of the world. I know, developers, stay with me. This is for a good cause. It's for accessibility. You will get pushback on this, but it's the right way. You'll have people be like, no, but you can like be more efficient if you strip it out like this. This isn't code, it's language. Language is much more complex than code. Hot tip, keep that in mind. Now, if you've noticed, we haven't really talked about JavaScript yet. All of these things are pretty universal. They're not specific to a platform, they're not specific to a framework. But another thing I learned, warning, is that JavaScript has an internationalization API, ECMAScript. There's also a ECMA 402 proposal to make it even more wide-reaching, I guess. It can do a couple things. It can do number format, and it can format dates and times, and then call later is the thing that orders it. So it's the one that tells you if you have an A with an accent, put that before a normal A, that kind of thing. So what is this? Let's take a look. If you went to your console, for example, this is all in there. It's all in JavaScript. And the way you do this is you say new, we love new, intel dot, and then the thing you want to use. So in this first case, number format. And then you pass it two things. One is the locale in that BCP 47 format. So language dash subtags. So in this case, it's JA is Japanese, as spoken in Japan. And then the second argument is options. So here we're passing a style option because we want it to be a currency. And we want the currency to be Japanese yen. And currencies all have codes too. Now once that is created, you can call the dot format option on it, pass it your number, which is up there, 123456789, because I'm creative. And then the output you get is a formatted string. Oh, you can't really see that well, but it's 123,457, no sense, because they don't really use that in Japan. But the CLDR knows that, therefore the JavaScript API knows that. They're really smart, the computers. And it has the currency symbol, which is cool. You can also do that with the date time format. So down here we have new intel.datetime format, DE German, spoken in Germany, and then some options, which I made a variable because it's long. We want the weekday to be long, the year to be numeric, et cetera, et cetera. And then you call .format on it, pass the date, and here you get some German with your long weekday, 20th of December, 2012. Now, this on its own is not that powerful. Here's why. The support is okay, but not, everywhere. And also, it's expensive, especially in a framework like React where you re-render stuff a lot. Because if you'll notice, we have to create a new instance every time we have a different language or type or option. And so if you have to keep up with the administration of that, like, oh, maybe in one place I want the date to be in long format, but maybe later in the page I want it to be in short format. Those would be two different instances. And the overhead of that would be a lot. So it's not really used on its own, but this is what it's all based on. Also worth noting that internationalization in JavaScript is still a work in progress. So if you are interested in learning how these standards get developed and put into the language, check out the proposals and the committees. You can Google them later. But there's a bunch of people still talking about how to evolve this on the web, which is pretty cool. But we need libraries. We love libraries. Disclaimer, the libraries I'm picking, I know. It doesn't mean they're the best. It just means the ones that I've used. I've had people come up to me and be like, why didn't you use my library? And I'm like, I'm sure your library is great too. I'm sure you're a star. However, this is what I know, so this is what I'll show you. Yahoo has an open source library called Format, which is pretty cool. Format is an internationalization library based on the ICU, based on the CLDR, based on BCP 47, based on the JavaScript Intel API. There's also currently these integrations for it, React, Ember, Handlebars, and Dust. It's all open source, so if you want to make an integration for Vue or for jQuery or whatever you want, you can, and just contribute. It also has some helper libraries. Message format is what we use to translate strings. You do need to polyfill some of this if you're using older browsers. Hot tip. So this is the React integration example. Again, apologies if you're not a big React user, but for example's sake, let's say we have a button, and we want the button to say sign in as, and then your name. But we want it to be in a bunch of languages. So we're going to import formatted message from the React integration for format. We're going to give it the ID of the string, of our original string, which we have in a JSON file somewhere else. We can pass in a default message, so in case that translation isn't available at that time, we'll default to English, fine. The string is written in ICU format with the little curlies template. And then value is the actual variable we're going to pass in. So in this case, JSday Italy. Now, once you actually render this, if you pass to your app that your locale is Italian, for example, it'll search in the Italian file. If you say German, it'll search in the German file. This is an example in Spanish. You don't even have to know what it says, but it can look into here. You'll notice we're using the select. We're using the plural right here. The ICU messages can be nested, and this is all just JSON. If you're not into React that much, or you need it somewhere where you don't want it to be a component, you can also just use the format JavaScript API, intel.format message. Easy as that. Pass in the ID. It outputs the string from the appropriate file. It's great. Woohoo! So that's the cake so far. Just a little reminder. Up to about here, it's just universal standards, then a little JavaScript, and then a little library specific. So that part you can change, shop around. There's a lot of open source ones. But that's not it with internationalization. It also has a logistics problem. And for anyone who's ever tried to do it, you probably are familiar with this. Let's say you build an app. OK, cool. I built an app. I want it to be internationalized, localized. So I get the strings in my app translated. I send it off to a translator, an Italian one, a German one, and a Spanish one. They come back. I deploy my site. Woohoo! I've made a project. I want to add a feature, though. It's not quite finished. It's an MVP. So all the strings for the new feature I need to get translated. Okay, but some languages are ready. The German guy was really diligent, but the Spanish one was a little late. Maybe he was on vacation. What do I do now? Do I wait until my Spanish translator comes back from vacation? Do I deploy the site, but partially? What happens if you want to see my site in Spanish and that string isn't translated? Do you get the default in English? Do you just not see that feature? And while all that is happening, what if you had a feature and it is ready? Maybe that was from earlier, or you used a different translator. Do you wait until the first one is ready to deploy this one? Do you do an incomplete release? It's not easy, and I'm honestly surprised we haven't super figured this out already. What if you want to change the existing text from the MVP? It becomes the cycle, you see. So there's this thing, it's called continuous localization, because the tech world loves buzzwords, which is where you automatically gather your strings, ship them off to be translated, and put them back into your project. There's a lot of this as a service, so you do have to shop around. There's not a lot of good free ones. But so for example, at my old job, we had one called Smartling, which would watch your GitHub commits. And then when it saw a new string, it would ship it off into its platform, which had a translation memory too. So if it's something that it had seen before, it would just commit it right back. And if it was something new, it would give it to a real person. And then when they were done, it would commit it right back into your pull request. So this cycle, if it was something it already knew, took about a couple minutes. And if it was something new, I guess depends whether it was office hours or not, but a couple hours tops. And then you could just merge your pull request and have all your languages ready. That being said, internationalization is much easier to integrate into your project early. For logistics, for prep, for architecture, but also for design, which people don't talk about that much. But let me give you an example. I used to work for a company called Trainline. I don't know if you know it, but you can buy train tickets. That's how I got here from Venice earlier. And we had this little widget where you select your tickets, right? And you search, and you get to the results page, and we say, we've selected a ticket based on price, so it's usually the cheapest one, and your search one, feel free to pick a different one. Cool. One day we were like, you know what, we want to ship this app in 14 languages, because now we have tickets all over Europe. I was like, okay. Tried German. Did not work out, because German words are long. So all of our text was sticking out. We were like, oh, crap. What do we do now? So we looked in the CSS and found that it had a fixed height for some reason. So we just removed it. And it fits. So curveball, but solvable. But how about this? Our old results page was based only on the UK. If you've ever traveled in train in the UK, it's a complex system. But basically, all of your ticket types were rows, and then all the times were columns. Fine. Some seats are almost sold out. We have prices. And then the product people come over and say, actually, we want it in Swedish krona, please, and in French, for all those Swedish French people that use our site. So you'll notice we're having a little trouble fitting it in. We've dropped the currency symbol. And also, the limited availability is real squished into that little box. So we called in a designer, and we called in a product person, and a Jira expert, and a bunch of developers, and we started a sprint, and we ended up with that. It's a whole redesign. It took weeks. It took 5 people, weeks, to redo this. Why? Because we didn't design with internationalization in mind. We didn't account for inflation. We didn't account for language, sizes of words. So again, start early. That doesn't mean you have to get translators right away. It just means that your code has to be adaptable when you start. It's easier. You can always retrofit it, but it'll be a pain. Also, hot tip, and this isn't super popular, but you can style for specific languages. But make sure to check browser compatibilities. There's the CSS language pseudo selector, where you do :lang and then pass in the language code. This is useful for stuff like quotes. If you're like doing like an article and you quote something, you can say, for the Q element, if it's in English, use the quotes. But if it's in French, use the little like bracket. Or in German, the bracket, but the other way. And then it looks like that. This isn't like, this should not solve all your problems, but like keep it in mind. It is helpful once in a while. And the other thing that's like sort of obscure, but I thought I'd mention because it's kind of cool, is line breaks. So not all languages delimit words. So you know how we write words with spaces? Not everybody does that. And it's not always obvious for a computer where to break a line when you wrap, especially now with a lot of mobile devices. So stuff like Thai and Khmer scripts, they're just, you know, straight line, no spaces. So this is a Khmer text. All of those lines are possible places where you could break a word, but none of them have spaces. So how do you tell a computer to do that? Currently, computers have to do dictionary lookup on these languages if they want to know where to break a text. Or you have to tell it explicitly where you can. So like humans can figure it out. You can just look at it and be like, yeah, that's a word. Sometimes it depends on the context of what was earlier in the sentence. But if you're interested in that stuff, there's a really cool W3 consortium article on it that is really educational. I've never had to work with TypeScript, but I hope one day I'll get this interesting challenge. So, what have we learned? Internationalization is part of accessibility. The current web does not match the current web users. And it's really within our power to fix that. So internationalize all the things. That doesn't mean you have to spend a lot on it. Just use a library. Put your strings in a separate file. It's that easy. And then maybe in a year, you'll be like, I want a second market for my product. You can just turn it on, just like that. Internationalization is supported by a bunch of standards. They're all open source, and it helps do it right, so be familiar with them. And if you're ever wondering, now you know what to Google for, at least, when it breaks. Try to start early if you can, for design, for prep. It helps headaches down the line. Sometimes it feels weird to start a project and put in internationalization, and like put all your strings in a separate file and be like, oh, this feels weird. I don't need this. I'm never going to use it, but you might. And it's not that much harder. You know what I'm saying? Always, always, always let your user pick their own locale. Always let your user pick their locale. Thank you. And this is the hottest insider tip. German is a great first test language because the words are super long and it will break your website 100% of the time. And you do it with a designer next to you. It's always really fun. I've been Ellie. Thank you so much. Say hi on Twitter and ask me questions later.